So we will now get started, and today we're going to hear from Mandile and Mpofu from Boston University, Katie Schulder-Battis from Northwestern, Sarah Shamin and Mishaal Shirazi, also from Northwestern, but Northwestern in Qatar, Kath Coetzer, and Julia Manipella. Julia is from the University of Oklahoma, and Kath is from Davidson. So welcome, and why don't you just come up here now?
All right. Can I start? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Mandile. I'm a graduate student journalist at Boston University, and I traveled to Namibia for 3 weeks in August. Namibia is a country in southern Africa, and I traveled to a region called Kunene. So I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. This is a picture of me as a young girl. People always say to get a few laughs in your presentation, but I'm not naturally funny, so I'll settle for some ahs instead. Anyway, as I've discovered my love for storytelling in recent years, I have kind of made it my mission to tell Zimbabwean stories from a decolonized lens. And that may sound elusive, but to me that just means telling our stories in a way that accurately and best represents us. So when I heard about the fellowship, I knew I wanted to do exactly that. So I pitched a story about the deplorable state of healthcare in Zimbabwe. And that's the story that got me the fellowship. However, when I told my mom about the fellowship, she said that maybe it wasn't the best time to come to Zimbabwe because some journalists had uncovered a political scandal that had kind of put them in the line of fire, and journalists were starting to disappear. So I was like, maybe not the best time to go, so I had to pivot. And with some brainstorming help from Professor David Abel, who is a professor at Boston University and a Boston Globe journalist, I decided to look into climate change. And I knew I wanted to stay in Southern Africa. So I came across this research paper by a Namibian scientist titled No Safety Net in the Face of Climate Change, the Case of Pastoralists in the Kunene region, Namibia. And the indigenous people in this region are called the Ovahimba and Ovaherero. They are traditionally livestock farmers, specifically cattle, and they've been farming since the 16th century. But because of the droughts, this lifestyle has become especially difficult because drought means low rainfall, and low rainfall means no grass for the animals to graze, which means livestock deaths. And I also learned that this region, Kunene, is expected to see a projected rise in temperatures of 7 degrees Celsius, which will have devastating effects on livestock farmers. And so after I found this research paper, I actually learned about a government initiative that was trying to help farmers overcome these challenges by distributing goats. And I thought, okay, that's it. That's what I want to write about. I want to write about goats. So the program distributed goats to 3 areas in the region, Fransfontein, Sesfontein, and Varamkwele. And the reason they distributed goats is because goats require less pasture to survive. Cattle require a lot of pasture, and because there is less pasture due to the droughts, the goats are better able to adapt to these drought conditions. So my central question was, how are the people of Kunene adapting to these climatic conditions with the help of IREMA, if they are adapting at all? And it was important for me to talk about this government initiative and how it was helping people, but I really wanted to paint portraits or write portraits of the people who were being affected by these conditions and the people who were receiving the goats. And my story actually took a surprising turn on my first day. We were driving home from a morning of speaking with government officials, and we drove past this beautiful fenced area with these tall date palms and a beautiful mountain view. And I asked my guides if we could stop by and see what was happening there. And it turned out that the same government program that was distributing goats to livestock farmers was reviving a community garden for residents in the area. And so my story ended up being one about goats and gardens. And instead of just talking to farmers about their goats, I ended up spending half of my time speaking with patrons of community gardens. And one of the women I spoke to is 43-year-old Helensi Somses, who started working at the community garden last year after the Irema project completed their improvements. And the Irema project installed drip irrigation pipes, they built a storage room for the farmers, and they also improved access to water for the plots. Now Helensi and the other patrons grow tomatoes, cabbages, sweet melons, onions, and carrots and beetroots, and they're also growing lemon trees at the garden. And Helensi said to me, "We work very hard, but there's no food," which is surprising since they're in a community garden. And she said this because it's not enough for them to just grow their own food. You know, that takes months. They also have to sell the produce that they grow, but that's really challenging because they have limited access to transportation into the towns where they would go to sell their produce. Helensi relies on government drought relief resources like all the other people in Kunene who are struggling, but the community garden gives her agency over her own food. And her face lit up when she told me that she actually took inspiration from the community garden to start a garden in her own backyard. 300 kilometers away, I met a 63-year-old woman named Rosalia Mbomboro, and she was born and raised in Sesfontein, and actually her great-grandparents used the exact same garden where she now farms tobacco. And when I met her, she had been kneeling on her haunches, weeding her tobacco plot for hours under the hot sun, and I asked her what she thought would happen if the droughts continued, and she said, very matter-of-factly, everything will die slowly but surely. But she was also really hopeful. She said, "I'm hoping that it will rain one day. God is not going to throw us away." So there are many reasons why this story matters. It fills the large gaps in coverage of climate change effects in Southern Africa, and it highlights the role that government can play in climate change adaptation. The Irema project has largely done what it set out to do, but it's only helped a very small percentage of the people in Kunene who are struggling with the droughts. And yes, the people are adapting to the droughts, and they are making incredible sacrifices to do so. They're not eating some days, they're working long hours in the gardens under the hot sun to harvest their produce. I want to make it clear that adaptation is not easy. And lastly, this story is not just about the loss of livestock and about people growing food in their gardens. It's about the loss of tradition and the loss of a centuries-old way of life. And that, to me, was a story worth telling. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Katie, and I'm from Northwestern's Medill campus in Chicago. So I'd like to start my presentation with a quote that is from one of my sources. There is no direct translation for the word community in the Mongolian language. That's a quote from one of my sources, Daria Azbayar, who I worked with throughout my entire 2.5 weeks in Mongolia and who referred me to countless other sources. And coming from a very small and tight-knit community in Brooklyn, I found this to be kind of mind-blowing, that in a country with 3.5 million people, there wasn't a word for community for thousands of years. This began to make a lot more sense when I did research on the background of Mongolia, which is the world's second most sparsely populated country, That means that you can go for 4 hours and not see another family or another structure there. But before I start talking about that, let me give you a little bit more background on Mongolia and what makes it such a unique culture. Like I said, Mongolia is the least densely populated country, and it's also located between Russia and China. So it has an extremely unique political and economic position in the world. Many people would assume that culturally it would be similar to one of those other countries, but it has an extremely unique culture as well as a unique language, and Cyrillic Mongolian is the alphabet that's used there. Mongolia transitioned to an independent democracy in 1990 and has undergone many social changes. It used to have a socialist government and was considered a satellite state of Russia. But after its transition, a lot of social upheaval happened, which has led to a lot of changes in the traditional agrarian lifestyle that herders used to practice. Mongolia is made up of over 600,000 square miles and is massive. But because of such a sparse population, that means that often people lived miles away from one another. And so, because of recent climate change effects, there's been a transition of nomadic herders moving towards large cities. Ulaanbaatar is the capital city of Mongolia. And as a nomadic country, the capital city is relocated 3 times. But now where it's positioned, thousands of herders are moving towards the city every year. This has led to a tremendous change in the amount of pollution in the area surrounding Ulaanbaatar. So something that I found really interesting when I was doing research before setting out on my trip was the way that the media represented Ulaanbaatar and the cities around Mongolia. Because they're so polluted, often the media represented them as being terrible places to live. There were extremely high rates of microcarbonate pollution that was leading to high levels of asthma around the country. When I was actually reporting, I found that people had a completely different story to tell around Ulaanbaatar. Many people found that there was a greater sense of community as more people had moved to living in close quarters next to one another. And lots of NGOs that I spoke with ended up affirming this. So I'm just gonna go to this. This is one of the NGOs that I visited. So while I was there, I found that the resilience and innovation of many of the nonprofit organizations around Ulaanbaatar were creating amazing solutions projects to actually combat the effects of pollution. So going back a little bit, one of my biggest inspirations for this project was a TED Talk that I heard several years ago called The Ancient Earth-Friendly Wisdom of Mongolian Nomads. The TED Talk was fascinating to me because it emphasized the ways in which Mongolian nomads practice sustainable practices, eating seasonal foods, using 100% of the animals that they raise. And the traditional agrarian herders, because of the constant movement, didn't practice very much farming. This changed a lot when the nomads moved towards cities like Ulaanbaatar. So one of the NGOs that I worked with most was GareHub. This is where Daria Azbayar worked as a program organizer. And one of the biggest projects that they emphasized was creating sustainable architecture based on traditional nomadic architecture. So gers in Mongolia, that's the word for basically yurts, which is yurts are the Russian word for it. So the concept of GareHub is that they were able to take the design of a ger and use sustainable technology in order to reduce pollution. So building architecture based on the gers that would use sunlight, retain heat, and create an environment where they could grow crops within the actual GareHub structures. So this is an image of one of the botany projects that's happening at GareHub right now that Daria was a part of. The idea here was that because there's a lack of available produce in the cities, If they're able to use sustainable technology, they can actually grow their own food year-round. So in order to reduce the amount of pollution in the city, they were able to create sustainable technology practices like this. Another organization that I worked with while I was there was UNICEF. And they were using programs that involved mapping the pollution in various places around Ulaanbaatar in order to determine where the highest risk to health were located. Eureka was another organization that I worked with. If you've heard of carbon credits before, typically 1,000 or 1 ton of CO2 that's either saved or prevented from entering the atmosphere ends up transferring to a single carbon credit, which can then be sold to companies trying to offset their carbon production. Eureka is a small NGO that was founded by residents of Ulaanbaatar with a concept that they could fractionalize carbon credits to create a way for individuals and families living around Ulaanbaatar to actually earn income by producing less waste. Public Lab Mongolia is another nonprofit that I worked with while there. They are based in a single room in an office building in Ulaanbaatar, and it was amazing to see the work that they were doing. They were able to train people to create maps of the city to determine where the highest rates of pollution were, and in order to figure out where they needed access to resources the most. What I was the most amazed by working with these NGOs was the ways in which all of these organizations actually worked together. The amount of collaboration that I found was astounding. For example, GareHub, which works to build these structures and provide resources to people in the areas surrounding Ulaanbaatar, works with Public Lab Mongolia in order to map where the resources are necessary. And they both work with Eureka in order to determine where the highest rates of pollution are. I found that while working with these organizations, something that was the most amazing was that it appeared from what I had read previously that mostly there was a mentality from the media that things in Mongolia were getting worse as traditional herding was decreasing and people were moving towards the cities, when in fact the amount of innovation that was inspired by these problems is something that could actually be transferable to other communities around the world. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Really nice presentation so far. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Mishaal. And we're from Northwestern University in Qatar.
And also, we're originally from Pakistan. So the topic of our project explores the intersection of Pakistan's increasingly devastating floods with the country's poor urban planning and how this intersection disproportionately affects the working class Hindu and Christian communities that live in Pakistan. Hindus and Christians make up for most of the religious minorities in Pakistan, which is a Muslim majority place. So there's a few different reasons why these communities are disproportionately affected by this intersection. And one of them is the residential segregation in Pakistan that happens against Hindus and Christians due to caste politics, and also a few other factors. There's actually a lot of discoveries we made. We learned about a climate refugee, climate migration crisis in urban and rural parts of Sindh mostly. And there's no way we can synthesize all of that in 8 minutes, so please ask us questions. So for now, I'm just going to talk about one church, and it's just because when I found out about this church, it just hit me how much one church affects an entire working class community, and it was pretty eye-opening. For some context, I was born and raised in Karachi. It's a coastal city in the south of Pakistan. It's very urban and very hyper-developed. We don't have a drainage system in Karachi. So when it rains, we have natural drains, which are essentially little streams. So the rainwater falls into the streams, and then it drains into the Arabian Sea, which Karachi borders. So naturally, across these drains, there are informal settlements, slum and squatter settlements. So one such drain is called the Gujjar Nala, and across the Gujjar Nala there are a bunch of settlements. So the settlement that I'm going to talk about is called Sadiq Nagar Tayyibad, or SNT, and SNT is a Christian majority place. So a lot of working class Christians live there. A lot of these are Dalit Christians as well, who were lower caste Hindus and who converted to Christianity when they came to Pakistan to escape caste-based discrimination and violence. So basically, I don't know, you probably know about the floods in Pakistan. In 2020, the floods reached an all-time high, and the Supreme Court ordered the disaster management authorities to do something about it. So what the disaster management authorities did was they ordered a large-scale anti-encroachment drive of the squatter settlements and the residents living across these drains, essentially taking a bulldozer and demolishing the houses of the people who lived in the slums across the drains, which I'm kind of rolling my eyes because that's not a sustainable solution to the problem. But essentially because of this, SNT was heavily affected by the demolitions, and a lot of Christian houses and places of worship were demolished. So the church that I wanted to talk about was the St. Joseph's Catholic Church. And basically what the government said was that they're demolishing illegal property, but the church wasn't really illegal. And besides clearing out the drain itself, they decided to build roads on either side of the drain. So they ended up destroying more houses than they had initially planned. The government's justification for that was that they're not demolishing the whole church. They had marked property that was in the way of the drain and the roads, and they had initially marked 22% of the church to be demolished. They ended up demolishing 40% of the church, which is almost half of the church. So they basically cut it in half and broke it, and the rest of it was rubble. And this was not just a problem with this church. A lot of property that was marked to be, for a certain percentage of it to be demolished, a lot more of it was destroyed, and there was lack of transparency in this process as well. So essentially, half of the church was demolished, and the government said that only half of it is demolished, it can still be used. But could it really? No. The demolitions did not only shake up the structure of this church physically, but also socially. Imagine, it's a working class Christian community. A large percentage, a large proportion of their social life is Sunday church. And now that the church is broken and there's threats of rubble and broken pieces falling on people, people stopped sending their children, their elderly, and their women, because in Pakistan spaces are very gendered, just out of the fear that broken pieces of the church would fall on them, and it just was not the same. I will hand it over to Mishaal, but essentially 4,000 Catholics lost their place of worship, essentially.
So with that, we also met a lot of people who were affected by not only like the church demolition, but also their homes getting demolished. We met a climate activist, his name was Adil, and he introduced us to this man called Salamat Masih. So what Salamat was a part of the People's Party in Pakistan, which is a really big political party and also in charge of Karachi. And basically, if you're a part of the People's Party, it's kind of like you're safeguarded against any problems. But it was different from him because he was living in an illegal settlement as well. And he had lost his leg in a workshop accident. But what was worse was that a week after Adil even met him, he lost his house to the demolitions as well. And this really made me realize how like natural disasters affect people. And when I'm reading the news, I hear things like, oh, 200 people lost their lives or 150 people lost their lives. And for me, like, while I try to imagine what it's like, it's always just a number at the end of the day. But meeting these people really made me understand how like it just doesn't mean 200 people. It means 200 families got affected, because now Salamat has to find a home for his family. And it's not that, the flood came and everything's over now because it's not in the news anymore. Like, it's his life now. It got affected forever. So while doing this story, it really made me realize, like, it really made me understand what, like, the intensity was and how, like, it affects people for a way longer time than what we think affects them. And we also met this woman called Mohini, and her story was actually very interesting because she's from interior Sindh. And there was a World Bank funded project there. It was called the LBOD. And basically what the LBOD did was it ended up flooding an area which never used to get flooded. And this was never in the news. Like, I've never read about it until I started doing this story because the World Bank just kind of put it under the covers. So what happened was that the World Bank came and they were like, okay, we need to do something about the drainage system. Let's make a drain here. And the indigenous voices were ignored. Mohini and other people were like, don't make a drain here. Like, this place doesn't flood up, so we don't need a drainage system here. But their voices were ignored, and a drain was constructed, which ended up flooding the whole place. And now a lot of people, they can't even live there. They had to move, and kids died, livestock died. People were not able to live in their homes anymore. So, like, doing this story really made me understand the amount of problems that exist and the amount of problems that are ignored as well. So, yeah, that's what we learned through this project. Like, it was really interesting. Our main project focuses on other people as well, but these were just 2 stories that we really wanted to share, and we hope you guys ask us more in the questions because we have a lot more to say. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kath. I go to Davidson College. And for my project, I looked at climate change and village relocation in Mustang, a region in Nepal. Owing to injury, I was unable to fully complete my project at this stage, so I'm not necessarily getting into the immediate dynamics of relocation, as I've only been to Lower Mustang, which is where people are considering relocation. But I'm hoping to travel to Upper Mustang, which is where villages have already been relocated and displaced. So firstly, where is Mustang? A Mustang, if you look at the map on your left, is that red thumb that juts up into the Tibetan Plateau. So it harbors a high-altitude mountain desert. It sits in the Trans-Himalayan belt and forms part of the Third Pole. Mustang's situation is also important in terms of considering where the population sit. If we see beyond the perceived fixity of contemporary state boundaries, the Mustangi people are more culturally and linguistically similar to Tibetan populations in Western Tibet, which means that Mustang within Nepal itself sits at the intersection of multiple axes of marginalization. Geographically, it's remote, although of course remoteness is relative. But it's also culturally and linguistically marginalized, given that when the contemporary state of Nepal was unified, it was championed as a Hindu empire and later as a Hindu nation state. And that has resulted in significant political marginalization. The map on the right is of Mustang itself, and you'll see that it's kind of cleaved through by the Kali Gandaki River, which extends from the Tibetan Plateau all the way down to the Bay of Bengal. And it's one of the deepest gorges in the world, which makes it a very precarious environment. So for my project, I mainly, thus far, have been in a village called Lubra. Lubra is one of the last solely Bun practicing villages in Mustang, in Nepal, if not in the world, and Bun is a pre-Buddhist indigenous Tibetan religion. The village was settled in the 12th century by Lama Yangton Tashi Gyaltsen, and he had arrived at this village he had arrived at this land, and upon seeing a walnut tree kind of emerge, that had been a sign that that was where he would settle in order to preserve and continue the Bun faith. But owing to climate change, villages like Lubra are under threat. Monsoon seasons have become more precarious owing to changing conditions, and glacial retreat is becoming exceedingly worse. And because of that, a river that would usually be a thin trickle with each monsoon season forms into a violent torrent that exploits the boulders it encounters to further its expansion and erosion. And because of that, the village is reconsidering relocation. But what I found is that people are sensitive to leave because of the political dynamics in place. As I hope to explore further in the north, there's generally been a policy of beggars can't be choosers. And there's also the issue of like what type of knowledge is privileged in relocation, giving in terms of how the village would be restructured if it was to move because of how specific the layout is in these traditional villages and how they maintain a certain type of like social life in general. And then the fact that these are generally aging communities. Lubra has 14 households and is experiencing rapid outmigration. So there's also the issue of building a mass consensus amongst the community when a lot of elders are skeptical of leaving ancestral land and heritage, especially since the Bund faith is so place-based. You know, the walnut tree is still there. For how long, people don't really know. And so even though they recognize that that village is likely to disappear in 10 years, they're very sensitive about moving. But the story I'm telling is not just about stagnancy and decline, because there are far more pernicious factors interacting in Mustang. Mustang is at the center of some rapid transformations in Nepal. Mainly, it's experienced quite a jolting absorption into the money economy. And so a new kind of monoculture based on apples has emerged, which largely caters to tourists and markets in the lowlands. But it's also emerged as a proxy through which tourists expect to observe a Tibet that is unoccupied by China. And so there's also the dynamic of people from the lowlands coming in and kind of like using it for tourism and making money. And as I tried to disentangle all these different factors, I encountered this quote in a Kathmandu-based newspaper. While the locals do not grasp the jargon of climate change, they feel its impact. And certainly the villagers do not articulate an awareness of climate change in terms of global warming, glacial melt. They won't mobilize terms like the greenhouse effect, but they articulate a profound understanding of climate change that perhaps better scrutinizes the assumed naturalness of disasters. In Lubra, the village is perceived as angry and vengeful because centuries ago, a lama, a spiritual leader, had supposedly used trickery and deceit to defeat another lama in a contest over religious knowledge. One of my interviewees explained, Jungrung Funtsok, that these changes, meaning developmental encroaches and kind of a shift away to a more technology-based agriculture, are related to the spirits of the land. They are not pleased, he explained. And I just wanted to bring that up because certainly while science and stuff is important, I think there's something to be gained from encountering the natural world as agentive and morally imbued. Thank you.
Hi. Let's see. Am I next? Okay. Hello, my name is Julia Manipella. I'm with the University of Oklahoma, and I visited Bangladesh, specifically Dhaka, for my reporting project. Home to over 22 million as of 2022, it is one of the most densely populated cities in the country, or in the world. As many of you have noticed in your own stories, my project was also nuanced. I came in believing that I was going to speak with a group of youth environmental activists. In the end, it revolved around luck, friends, and being open to the pivot, which I'll highlight later in the talk. My project covered the complex and intense industry of sustainable textile and crafts work within Bangladesh. I reached out to academics, entrepreneurs, and government workers who are building up a community in Bangladesh that believes that they can change the industry. Right now, how many of you, by a show of hands, know where the clothes you're wearing are from? right? Most of us don't really think about it. That's okay. It's one of those things that we don't really have in our day-to-day basis, right? You get up in the morning and you put clothes on, and it's not something that you do kind of reflect on. It's complex and nuanced. Sorry, lost my spot. With one of the largest RMG and fast fashion exporters, Bangladesh houses a growing class that can support themselves and their children's purchases, endeavors, and this group may be providing the opportunity to challenge fast fashion and RMG or ready-made garment factories in the industry in the nation through reviving craft. I had the pleasure of interviewing a diverse group of entrepreneurs, managers, government workers, and employees on respect, compensation, work, and company culture that is the business across Bangladesh that hold hope for their local economy. I could go on forever about why big international companies ethically should back up their bold comments with compensation for environmental waste management and ETPs, or effluent treatment processes. Really fun stuff, guys, I know. Stay with me, please. A process is designing for treating wastewater from these companies, and it's really complex, especially with grid blackouts. These things can not work all the time. They have to be on 24/7. Things don't work out, right? I can go on about that, but I won't. I'd like you to know that, and take out of this, the importance of the stitch and also the pivot. Because of the 19 sit-down interviews I conducted over the month that I was there, over half emphasized the importance of the person behind the garment. Many noted the tragedy of Rana Plaza collapse of 2013, but one interviewee noted the importance of the whisper from poor industry management for years. As the activist told me, the whispers of 4 to 5 lies over 5 years prior to the incident led to the shouts of 1,100 deaths. You see, unprompted, Rana Plaza was a consistent topic in my interviews. I never asked a single question about it because I didn't think that it was my place to bring it up. As we all know, some of us have had trauma and different things come up in our projects, and it's a hard thing to ask people to recollect. I'd like you to understand that this wasn't a small incident, and it affected generations within Bangladeshi life and manufacturing. And many of the interviewees became passionate about their own businesses because of this event. I specifically worked with finding the current potential and opportunity for sustainable industry in textile and garment work in and around Dhaka, Bangladesh. The country will face an alarmingly high level of climate change issues in the coming years. They're known for this, and they're an RMG sector. But what isn't yet globally known is the group of millennials and Gen Z creatives working to promote waste management, compensation, and sustainability in their local economy through crafts and innovation. Though my project was a documentary and photo essay, I sat down with leaders in the field that believe their businesses and practices can show how the fast fashion corporations run their factories doesn't have to be the future of Bangladeshi production. As for the pivot I mentioned earlier, I need to go back to pre-production. Anyone who's pitched a documentary, photo essay, or in-depth story knows that it isn't always what it seems. Yet leaving the door open and the option to come up with new ideas was difficult for me. Brought me to the community of young creatives that I ended up covering. My 2 takeaways lie in this and the stitch. Every day you get up, get dressed, and go about your day. I encourage you to take a moment to think about the humans that made each stitch of those clothes and be present and available for a pivot to be possible in your everyday life, because those 2 actions may just open up opportunities to understand how your own circumstances may be more connected to global citizens than you've ever anticipated, and provide room as a journalist for those to come to the table as groups you didn't get to pre-report on. Thank you.
Thank you all. And those were terrific presentations, and also the photography you showed is superb. So thank you for the presentations, thank you for the photos. And we'll start with questions, very open to questions from the audience and from you. But first, do any of you have questions for each other? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was sort of wondering, because the word pivot kept kind of coming up in everyone's presentation, how do you find a balance between like pursuing the question that originally inspired you to look for a story, and then following kind of new leads that seem to become more relevant, or adapting because of safety concerns?
Can we start?
Sure. So that's to everyone?
Yeah, to everyone.
What we started off with was very different from what we ended up with, and the story ended up being dictated very much by what our sources said. So I feel like we didn't find a balance. We ended up doing where our sources led us, because we realized that there's a lot of, the topic that we were working on was very underreported, and all of our information that we uncovered from the sources just took our story in a very different direction. So there wasn't much of a balance.
Yeah. I think that when we proposed the story, our topic was very much what we were seeing in the media. But then when we started talking to the sources, we realized there's so much more to it, which is why we decided to focus on the fact that wasn't shown in the media. So that's how we kind of navigated our project.
Anyone else?
Okay, I can. I had a few pivots within my project, I would say. But I think what ended up really working for me was being open to people being good people and giving you the opportunity to find a story within their community. I had a lot of excitement around me being there and wanting to understand what I was doing within just the creatives that were there, because it was a large group of like 30 some odd that I met. And I didn't get to interview everyone, but when it came down to it, watching for the stories that really stood out to not just me, but the people around them as well, where they would advocate for their friends having incredible stories and being good for the opportunity, really, really stood out to me and made it easier to choose a pivot for sure.
Okay. Other questions? Go ahead.
I have a question for Kath. I'm wondering if you got a sense in your reporting of what is lost when people out-migrate from their villages.
I think it's mainly that, like, in these villages, the social structure is so traditional. So in the village I was based out of, Lubra, it's like a tradition that, like, the oldest son will be a priest, and that's been continuing for centuries. So that's quite hard. And I think a different dynamic with these mountain communities in Mustang, they have large settled populations in New York, and it's not necessarily that those like strands of kinship dissipate. It's just harder because people try and like send money back, which kind of is like a core of tradition, and kind of they're trying to fulfill some type of like social obligation, but obviously money can't replace a physical presence as much as they try. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good questions. Anybody else?
Not right now.
Okay, so I think you had your hand up. All right, we're going to ask people who ask questions to stand up and tell us your name and your school.
Hi, I'm John Schmelzer from the University of Oklahoma. And one of the things that you do in this is you have to go and conceive where your story is going to be published. So, each of you, have you thought through? Have you made contact? Have you done anything to go and get your story ready to be published? And where is it going to be published?
I'm going to answer first and then hand it over to you. All of the stories are published on the Pulitzer Center website. Our reporting fellows have the option to pitch them. It's not a requirement. Okay, any comments here? And go ahead.
Yes, I did think about this a lot, especially because my story is not one that American outlets would typically go for. They don't write a lot about Southern Africa, but I did pitch to a couple of climate-centered publications, as well as more global publications. I did hear 2 no's and then a lot of radio silence, but I'm still in the pitching process. Also pitching Namibian publications as well.
I'm also still in the pitching process, but I'm also working with local reporters who are in Ulaanbaatar, because something about my project that I think is a little bit unique is that I think that the topic matter that I'm writing about, especially in terms of pollution that's locally produced, I think it really is most relevant to people who live in the local area. So my priority is going to be having a story appear that's accessible to people who actually live there, and then can make contact with NGOs or can make decisions based off of the information in it.
So we haven't reached out to places yet, but again, we were also looking at some global publications that do climate stories. At the same time, we were looking at some up-and-coming radical Pakistani publications as well because of the nature of the story. Also, our sources very rightfully demanded that we translate our work into Urdu and Sindhi. So and we're also looking at data visualization and sonification, because a lot of the work we did was related to data. So there's a lot of work that has to be done before we look into that.
Yeah, I've kind of focused on a mix of Nepal-based newspapers as well as, I guess, Malaya-themed outlets in general. But I would like to, I guess, pitch my story. I'm still writing and I'm finishing my reporting early next year at a more Western audience, just because I feel like the National Geographic lens on the Himalayas looms so large, and I'd kind of like to penetrate that a bit. Yeah.
I want to explain here. I don't think you quite explained that you spent quite a bit of time in Nepal. Kath did this summer, and then she broke her arm. So she went back home, and she's going to return to Nepal. That's why this story is very drawn out, in a good way. The story, not the arm. Julia.
Okay. Well, I'm also in the pitching process. I'm finishing up a documentary. I kind of mentioned it, but as you can tell, something about public speaking is so much different when you're at a podium. So yeah, I'm doing a documentary, so I'm planning on translating that also into Bengali, so then it can be distributed locally in Bangladesh. And so once that's happening, then I'm going to be distributing the documentary. I'm looking locally. I've also started looking at sustainable and fashion outlets as well. I didn't think that it was going to be fashion when I started the project, so I didn't really think of those from the start. But now it's kind of looking a lot more fashion than it originally was.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Layla?
Hi, everybody. My name is Layla. I'm representing Hunter College. And this question is for everybody. I was wondering 2 things. If you saw any resistance to climate adaptability within cultural communities where they're like, I don't want to give up my culture because my climate is changing. And then secondly, did you find any climate denial? I think that in America, climate denial is a really big thing. It's politicized. And we have a lot of access to information. So I was wondering if these, sort of rural communities are also experiencing climate denial. Thanks.
Yeah, one thing I'll say about Nepal in general is that there is wide consensus that climate change is an issue, which is kind of why I get frustrated by the idea of they can't label the greenhouse effect. They're somehow backwards and stuff. And in the communities, I'll say the religious dynamics in Nepal are quite vexed, and so it's not that people privilege culture over climate and stuff, but I think, especially in these mountain communities, it's the only solution is adapt or die, whatever. And they're more concerned with how do you mitigate, the two aren't necessarily diametrically opposed. Yeah.
Can I add something? So there is climate denial in Pakistan, but it's mostly within upper class people. The people who are actually experiencing the problems cannot deny what's going on. And when it comes to the cultural resistance, the climate injustices that are happening against the communities that we're covering, it's rooted in erasure of their culture and in aggressions towards their culture and their identities as well. So we didn't face any resistance of that sort either.
Yeah, like the people we were talking to, they were they were actively saying that this is a problem and it's happening and we're facing it. So like the rural communities didn't really have much climate denial. They were like very in it and they were understanding that this is actually happening.
Oh, and also the flooding isn't only, the whole point of our project is that the flooding isn't only increasing because it's raining more and more, which it is, but it's also increasing because there's developmental problems. So it's beyond a climate problem for our case.
For me in my reporting, I didn't find a lot of denial, but what I did see was a lot of just lack of awareness. And also, even though there was a lot of pollution where I was reporting, I found that people felt that because of financial constraints, they were unable to really do anything about the pollution that their households were making. So yeah, I feel like there also just needs to be more accessible information that's just distributed to communities in alternative ways that aren't just online and in newspapers.
Similar to Katie, there was no climate denial per se, but I think my research paper that my story was based on was published in 2018, and in that paper, the researchers had interviewed pastoralists in Namibia and had found that I think it was like 83% of them had never heard of climate change before. But the fact is, like, climate change means so many different things, and while they hadn't heard of the word climate change, they knew that there were droughts in their country, so they could see the changes happening over time, and they know how to handle droughts specifically. And then in terms of resistance to adapting to climate change, I mentioned earlier that people in this region are cattle farmers, so there's a lot of resistance to switching to goat farming because cattle is seen as a status symbol, and the more cattle you have, the more respect you have in the community. A lot of people also don't want to sell their goats during times of drought, again, because it's considered, one farmer told me, like, my goats are my bank, so the more goats you have, the more money you have in the bank. And then my last thing is that a lot of them believe in God, and kind of, I guess there's like a hard time holding the God part of what is happening in their country with like the science part of what is happening in their country.
I'd say mine is very similar to a bunch up here. I think a lot of Bangladeshi citizens, they know and they've seen the changes over the years in their communities, specifically around rivers, especially with pollution. But the thing is they rely, much like the bank of goats, they rely on industry to come in and work there, and they don't want it to go away. They just want compensation, and they want it to be done ethically, and that falls a lot on the companies that are coming in and asking for cheap labor and not providing the situations that they need in order to make it better for them and their resources. And so, yeah, I think they've been trying to move towards adaptation and mitigation, and that's definitely been like a new, more recent thing, at least that I've seen. But they also are in this kind of cultural awareness that they are used to recycling within their own culture. Like, they are used to hand-me-downs that are cherished and loved and used for generations, and it's kind of a hard thing to break within our current society of fast fashion, and they see it in their own communities as well. So I think it's kind of a mixed moment, yeah.
Okay, thank you, and great question, great answers. But who's next? Lali?
Hi, you guys all did amazing presentations. I have a billion questions, but I'm going to try and stick to two. So my first question is for Mandile. When you were in Namibia, did you notice, because so a long time ago, like 10 years ago, I was doing like climate change fieldwork in Botswana, and I noticed that there was a lot of tension between like the government and kind of having a non-diversified economy based largely on like mineral extraction and stuff, and how it was kind of opposed to how people were adapting to desertification, especially in the Kalahari. So I was wondering if you because it seems like in your project there was a lot of support from the government. So I was just wondering if you also saw any tension. And then for Katie, my question was, when I was visiting Mongolia, I saw that there was obviously, like outside of Ulaanbaatar, there was a lot of connection to the natural environment. It's like part of the tradition, the cultural tradition. So I was wondering if you saw any ties between like how people felt about their identity as Mongolians and like some kind of commitment to taking care of the environment or something like that.
Thanks for the question, Lalani. I wouldn't say there was tension per se. The government and the community really collaborated on this project. They consulted with farmers' unions. They had meetings because actually in Namibia, in the area where I was, the constituencies, which is what they call like neighborhoods essentially, are represented by traditional village chiefs. And so the village chiefs ensure that any government programs implemented there are serving the people, which I think is such an amazing system. So there was no tension in that project, but I think this project ran from 2019 and is supposed to end next year in 2024. 2024. And it's, like I said in my presentation, it only assisted a very small percentage of farmers. The specific number is 56, which is very small because Kunene, the region, has a population of 80,000, and I think about 67% of those people rely on livestock farming, and a lot of the people want the government to do more. The one woman I spoke to, Helensi Somses, who I showed there, she wants the government to take over the community garden, which is not what they're doing. They went there to solely make improvements and provide them with the resources so they could do the work themselves. But the patrons of the garden want the government to actually manage the garden because it is really challenging to sell the produce that they grow in the garden. Yeah.
To answer your question about commitment to the environment and to nature, something that was really interesting to me about the city is that about 20 minutes outside of the city, you would never guess that you were near an extremely populated city. So many people who work in the city and who I interviewed end up leaving the city regularly over the weekend and going camping and have like a very strong connection to nature. Like the woman who I interviewed, Daria, studied forestry for her bachelor's degree. And I think that that's sort of the driving force of what a lot of NGOs are doing. I think that many of the people who have moved towards the GARE areas outside of the city might just have less information a little bit like about it. But I think that there is a sense of awareness that there's a problem kind of universally and also a desire to make things better.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Jackie from the University of Richmond, and my question is for Mandile. You had very stunning photography, but I also noticed that the people you featured were women, so I'm wondering if that is who you found were most of the people working at the gardens.
Thanks, Jackie. Yes, actually, this one garden that I went to, the Franz Fontaine Community Garden, was mostly patronized by older women and then younger men. So I thought that was a really interesting dynamic. And a lot of the women are the heads of their households, which is surprising for this region because it is male-dominated. I did speak to some male farmers, but the women were more open, and this is something I actually had found in my pre-reporting, that the women were more willing to speak about their struggles. I don't know, I guess that's just a cultural phenomenon. I also did choose to prioritize featuring women in my story because they're the ones who are caretakers. One of the women I spoke to looks after her 12 kids and then her kids' kids as well. So they're like really important in the community.
Okay, you had a question, right?
Hi, I'm Maddie Keys from the University of Oklahoma. I really loved hearing about all of your projects. So for those of you that went to countries that you've never been to before and reported on communities that are different from your own, what steps did you take to be culturally sensitive and culturally informed in both your reporting and producing?
And that's to anyone? Is that right? Okay. Who wants to take that?
I think a lot of it was checking in, at least me personally. I don't speak Bengali, so it was a lot of making sure that I was going to be sensitive to language and knowing if I needed a translator or not. And then I lucked out, and I have really great professors that have connections in the country where I was going. And then from there, I networked and made sure that I was keeping to cultural norms and wearing the correct things and not stepping too far out of cultural boundaries within my process, yeah.
Yeah, I was quite fortunate that I'd already spent a semester abroad in Nepal. I hadn't gone to that region, but I was familiar at least with like Himalayan cultures at large, and I had a network based out of Kathmandu who I could use in terms of like speaking to them about how to approach going to Mustang. I feel like as well, just like making an effort, like I'd studied Tibetan. I'm not good at Tibetan. I can say like a few phrases, but I think like being humble and like at least trying to make an effort and speak their language made me more approachable, because obviously I failed. They laughed a lot. There was like less of that like power dynamic of me like coming in as this like lordly journalist. Yeah.
Okay, anyone else?
I think for me, just building connections with sources outside of the context of interviews and just having conversations, just to make sure that my reporting wasn't like extractive, and kind of bringing up topics that I wanted to report on in this open-ended way where they could say like, you're not really asking the right question here, or like the way that this has been portrayed doesn't really reflect how people feel about it. Just to make sure that when I do come to the interviews, I'm actually asking things that people have answers to and feel are important to talk about.
This is not something I struggled with during my reporting trip because I had never been to Namibia before, but I actually found that a lot of the like cultural customs are the same as in Zimbabwe, where I'm from. So I actually built a lot of connections with the people I was reporting on because we had similar words in our native tongue, which was really cool. But in terms of writing my story, I made sure to include like how they called the droughts, and they actually name every drought, like give the droughts names, so I made sure to include that in my story. Any traditional dress that they wore, I made sure to use whatever words that they would use, because I wanted to make sure that I was representing them the way they see themselves, and if they were to read my story, they'd be like, okay, this is who I am.
Great. Thank you. So naming the droughts is like our naming hurricanes, I guess, yes. So I think we're going to have to close there, but I think this was a fascinating panel and great discussion. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And I was also struck by something Bebe and Mayara talked about yesterday, how you zoom in on one character to tell a larger story. And I think many of you are describing similar experiences in your narratives.